Our top story right now, though, is the damning testimony today from one of the few people who was in the room as Donald Trump's aides and fixers hatched the entire Ukraine plot. Bill Taylor was the top U.S. diplomat for Ukraine. He objected to any effort at extracting a bribe from Ukraine to help Donald Trump get reelected. And he did so at the time in writing in those now infamous texts saying it was, quote, crazy to condition security assistance on Donald Trump's political campaign efforts. So this scene today is certainly not what Donald Trump wanted to see. You're watching Mr. Taylor go through security and make his way through Capitol Hill to tell his story, to recount his evidence. He ultimately spent hours with lawmakers behind closed doors. And how did it land? Well, here's how one Democrat summed it up.
In my 10 short months in Congress, it's not even noon, right? And this is my most disturbing day in Congress so far. Very troubling.
Very troubling. Other accounts suggest that reaction was shared in the room. Other House Democrats said they recounted disturbing details that Mr. Taylor shared, that as he went through the methodical evidence and notes that he'd taken, it provoked sighs and gasps as he depicted the workings of an alleged criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of the Trump administration. So right now, before we bring in our experts, and as I mentioned, we have some great ones tonight, I want to walk through the key points that Taylor made, which have just come into our newsroom here in this past hour. One, he drew a direct line between Ukrainians doing this political favor for Trump in exchange for military aid. That was contingent on the bribe that Donald Trump was soliciting, forcing Ukraine to probe the DNC and the Bidens, and that he wanted a public declaration they would do it. Let's stop right there. That is key. You have someone who was inside this process saying the process was to extort a bribe from Ukraine. Now, Congress and prosecutors may ultimately decide if that evidence leads to a crime or a high crime. So that comes down the road. But what's new tonight is that there is an official on the record asserting it, which is significant. And in Mr. Taylor's 15-page opening statement, which has now just become public, he offers a peek into what he told that room of investigators on impeachment today. He lays out his background as a diplomat, how he came out of retirement at the request of Secretary Pompeo, only to get to Ukraine and find a, quote, weird combination of encouraging, confusing, and ultimately alarming circumstances. An irregular, informal channel of U.S. policymaking on Ukraine that turned on Mr. Giuliani. That matters because it is new confirmation of what you've already heard about, what we've been reporting about, the reason why the president's close to impeachment, that there is the allegation of a shadow foreign policy, doing the bidding of Mr. Trump's reelection. It's also a corroboration of what the whistleblower alleged, of what the White House call notes said, depicting Donald Trump assigning Giuliani to extort political favors from Ukraine. Giuliani, of course, is now under criminal investigation as well, and I have more on that later tonight. Now, here's another point you have to understand to see why today was so big. Taylor today has new details of incriminating evidence against Trump that he says, this ambassador, he personally heard an unidentified voice on the phone stating that Ukraine's aid would be held up at Trump's direction. More evidence of the plot. And then later he learned that a key official directly told the Ukrainian leaders the security assistance money would not come until their president committed to pursue the Biden probe Trump wanted. That's bad. Now, if at this point in the broadcast you think, is this kind of stuff we've heard before? The answer is yes, but a special kind of yes. This incriminating evidence is repetitive in the worst possible way for President Trump. This is the same damning plot. Money for Biden probe, repeated by different people at different times, which Taylor says ultimately made him, quote, very concerned. So concerned, he sent the text that we all know about in the whole debate that everyone's been having about what it means when someone says don't condition aid on re-election favors. So today Congress gets the context for that whole series of exchanges, which ultimately led to a phone call with Donald Trump's loyalist, his appointee, Gordon Sondland. And here's what Taylor told the Congress today. Quote, during that phone call, Ambassador Sondland said Trump told him he wants Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, to state publicly Ukraine will investigate Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in 2016. That's the whole DNC Biden stuff. And he said, quote, everything was dependent on such an announcement, including security assistance. Quid meet quo. There it is. The Biden stuff for the money. Now, things were obviously bad for Donald Trump before today. Donald Trump admitted he wanted the Biden probe from Ukraine. His chief of staff admitted to a quid pro quo last week, tried to walk it back. So if you say, okay, Ari, what is different about this today, this repetition, if you will, well, it is worse because this is the person on the inside detailing the facts and the time and the place of the quid pro quo. And what happened next? We know a little bit about this as well today. Taylor then told the Congress that he asked Sondland, that Trump loyalist, to push back and try to stop this whole money for investigation idea. And Sondland allegedly said he would try, but then later said Trump was adamant that Zelensky himself had to clear things up and do it in public. And despite Sondland texting a Trumpian denial, the plan was still either Ukraine and Zelensky did this and commit to clear things up in public, or there would be a stalemate. So if Trump admits to the goal, get the probe to help him in 2020, and Mulvaney admits to the method, demand a quid pro quo bribe, what's new tonight, why this is a bombshell, is that today Ambassador Taylor confirmed the incriminating how, exact conversation and timing and details for getting it done. Rarely do you see this in the light of day, in black and white, the operational details for what many experts believe is a crime, or what Mulvaney insists is just foreign policy. Get over it. And there's one more difference between Donald Trump and Mulvaney over here and Ambassador Taylor here today. They admitted incriminating things and then still defend them. Taylor's detailing some of the same things. He's not defending them today. He's against them. He's sounding an alarm. He is trying to stop that plot. He tried at the time in writing, and he's trying to stop any further such plots today. You might say he's blowing the whistle. And finally, here is how he told Congress about his now famous warning in those text messages. Quote, I said withholding security assistance in exchange for help with a domestic political campaign would be crazy. I believed that then, and I still believe that. He's staking his whole career and integrity on that. Believe that. The diplomat has spoken. Who believes him could decide the future of this entire impeachment debate. I turn now on this big news night to former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, Washington Bureau Chief for Mother Jones, David Corn, and Betsy Woodruff Swan, a reporter for the Daily Beast. Good evening, everyone. David, on a scale of 0, nothing to it, to 10, bombshell, where do you put today's testimony?
A Spinal Tap 11. In some ways, Trump is good at getting his, pursuers to chase their own tail. It is a quid pro. It's not a quid pro quo. Mulvaney comes out and says it is and it isn't and all this. And the words themselves in the White House transcript clearly say, if you want Javelin missiles, you have to give us this favor. And the favor is investigating the DNC server and investigating Biden. The favor's two parts to it, equally important. In fact, I think the DNC server is more important to Trump because it gets him off the hook on the 2016 Russian attack. And so we know that. But now we have somebody who kept meticulous notes throughout his whole career, giving us the chronology. And and all prosecutors know, there's nothing better than a chronology, right? You have notes that back him up. You have texts. He talks about cables in this chronology. Well, you can get those cables. They exist within the State Department logs. And it clearly shows that even when they say it's not a quid pro quo, in that one conversation you cited, it is a quid pro quo. We're not calling it that, but unless he does what we want, which is to publicly say, not just to do an investigation, but to publicly say that they're investigating the Bidens, which would taint the Bidens, it's a stalemate, meaning the aid's not coming. And it's important to know, if the aid doesn't get out by, I think, mid-September or so, it disappears. It goes back to Congress. So this was a real muscling operation, very mob-like. And Will Taylor was, saw Giuliani as the mixer in all this and wanted out. And he's going to, we don't know what he told beyond the statement, too. It's a very detailed story about a very crooked operation.
Joyce, how important is it that this testimony comes from someone in the room where it happened?
He's a great witness, Ari. His statement indicates that he began his service in the State Department in 1985, and he served presidents from both parties. In other words, he's the ultimate disinterested witness. He's a career guy. He doesn't have a political axe to grind. And his testimony makes it really even more stunning. We talked about it at the time. Absolutely jaw-dropping that DOJ did not investigate the referral from the whistleblower, because what we see here, and Ambassador Taylor says that it's crazy, his characterization, to withhold aid in exchange for favors for a political campaign. I would call it a crime. It's a really clear instance of bribery or extortion. DOJ gave it a pass and is instead putting the burden on Congress to investigate. And I think Congress is finding, frankly, a lot of evidence that DOJ and this president wish had not come to light, because it is damaging.
Let's have you build a little bit on that point. Viewers know that you're a former federal prosecutor and U.S. attorney, and so you've looked at hard cases, and sometimes something looks bad and there's not enough evidence. Often what tips over the edge is whether you have the corroboration, not just one person or one story, but the real evidence of it going down. And so you're saying what you see today, Joyce, regardless of whether Mr. Barr's DOJ is investigating it fully or not, is you see enough of that evidence that says this was actually an illegal bribery plot, meaning before you even get to what the Congress thinks is impeachable, you see Mr. Taylor outlining potential crimes committed inside the United States.
He is clearly outlining conduct, and there are other witnesses who've talked about it, perhaps most notably the president's chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, who got on national television a few days ago and seemed to concede that there was a quid pro quo. But the reality here is we have a credible witness. There is a lot of other evidence that comes into the mix that indicates that a crime was committed. And of course, as you point out, Congress doesn't need a crime for impeachment. They're looking at an abuse of trust. But when you have a crime, that is almost just a clear instance of the abuse of trust. It makes it much easier to establish it. And that's what we've got here.
Betsy, take a listen to Congressman Kapoor today on all of this.
What do you make of these incredulous text messages that have come out from him, questioning the administration policy on Ukraine from after he got back into the country?
Well, he walked into a rat's nest. And I think that, and the rats there are very big.
Betsy.
It's a tough moment. It's a really tough moment for congressional Republicans and for the president. And what's especially noteworthy about the testimony from Bill Taylor today is the extent to which he details a roadmap for where the rest of the investigation might fruitfully go. One thing that numerous Democratic representatives who I chatted with on the Hill today brought up are concerns that Gordon Sondland could have given bad information to Congress when he testified several days ago. Of course, he was the administration's ambassador to the EU. He was part of this effort, according to Taylor, to pressure the Ukrainians to publicly announce an investigation of the company connected to the Biden family. And many Democrats now believe that Sondland might have potentially either lied to them or indefensibly given them information that would have been bad. Another person who's an important character that shows up throughout Bill Taylor's testimony is Tim Morrison. Morrison is the head of the Eurasia desk at the National Security Council. He has the job that used to belong to Fiona Hill. Taylor cites extensively conversations that he had with Morrison in this testimony. At one point, he says that Morrison told him the Trump-Zelensky call, quote unquote, could have gone better, a.k.a. not the perfect phone call. And it's pretty clear just from looking at this initial statement, the Democrats are also going to want to bring him in.
Yeah.
He's another new person who would have a ton of information that would be relevant to what they're looking at.
Well, you had great details there. And of course, we started discussing this about the spectrum of zero to bombshell. On the spectrum of perfect to impeachable, I think we're nearing impeachable according to these witnesses and far from perfect. Joyce, I want to read to you the Ukraine side of all this, because, again, we're talking about diplomacy and what people were concerned and what message was received. Mr. Taylor here saying President Zelensky's sensitive about Ukraine being taken seriously and not as an instrument in Washington domestic re-election politics. What does that tell you as a prosecutor or a fact finder, that if you're pushing a bribe, you're trying to extort a bribe from Ukraine, to help you get re-election. What does it tell you that Mr. Taylor, if he's credible, and we haven't heard otherwise that he's not, is saying the fact is Ukraine thinks it is that quid pro quo?
You know, Taylor's expressing concern throughout about national security. That's his wheelhouse. He's talking about the importance of Ukraine to our national security, to Europe, to combating the threat from Russia. And then we have this interesting piece of information where we learn that Trump's perfect phone call, the call where Trump tells us the Ukrainians never felt any pressure to provide any favors. We have this conversation where Taylor says, you know, the Ukrainian president has conveyed to us through one of his advisors that he feels like he is being used as a tool in this re-election campaign that the president is waging in the United States. That, I think, is really the kicker in these 15 pages of testimony, this notion that the Ukrainians perceive this as a quid pro quo, as a bribe or an extortion situation.
Yeah, and I think that's very interesting. Betsy, does the pile of allegations and facts here make it harder for some Republicans to defend or want to defend this?
It certainly does. I chatted with one Republican today before the statement was released publicly, or not released, but leaked, I guess, technically.
Sure.
But after people started realizing the gist of it, who said that the only thing that mattered to him was what Trump himself actually said to Zelensky, and that since Taylor wasn't on that call, Taylor wasn't relevant to the efforts that Democrats have moving forward to impeach the president. If that's the best argument that Republicans have, they're in a really tight spot. The reality is Taylor has detailed knowledge of very much of how this has played out. And in addition to that, part of what he describes in this event is showing the extent to which he was worried about the Ukrainians being betrayed by the United States. He talks about trying to make sure that Zelensky wasn't going to go on TV and promise to investigate Biden in 2016, and then potentially see the United States fail to ultimately provide the aid that they had promised. In other words, Taylor was worried that the U.S. would break its promise to Zelensky, humiliating Ukraine and providing a boon to the Russian government. The fact that a career experienced diplomat had that level of concern about the willingness of the Trump administration to keep its word is something that's going to chill many Republicans in Congress.
Yeah, you lay it all out there, and a lot of it is the national security implications as well as what has become a consuming scandal for the White House. Betsy Woodruff Swan, Joyce Vance, thanks to both of you. David, I'm going to give you a break and come back to you later in the hour for something else. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.